And like I said before, I've read a lot of testimonies from veterans of that war and seen documentaries and talked to them in person. And they all said there were two wars fought. There was our war and there was Hollywood's war. Can you find it in your heart to tell the story of our war? And when they said that to me, I was an instant convert. I said, yes, I will tell the story of your war. I'll try to be as conventional to your experience and unconventional, therefore, to the American Hollywood experience as I possibly can be.
If the template for the Wardaddy stereotype was laid down by actors like John Wayne and Lee Marvin, the modern version was established by Tom Hanks in Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. The film is set during the Second World War and takes place a few days after the Allied invasion of France in 1944. In terms of the film's agenda, Spielberg was very upfront about why he made Saving Private Ryan, and it's all pretty much spelled out in the two scenes that bookend the movie. Basically, he made the film to pay tribute to veterans like his father, who had fought in World War II. Like many other directors before him, he also claimed that he wanted to convey the true horror of combat in order to correct the sanitised depictions that he'd grown up with and to some extent contributed to. To that end, Saving Private Ryan opens with a nightmarish depiction of the Allied landings at Omaha Beach. This sequence, which was shot in a sort of pseudo-documentary style, lasts for an excruciating 20 minutes, and is about as intense a depiction of combat as you're ever likely to achieve in a theatre without actually shooting live rounds at the audience. These opening scenes arguably won the film its Oscars for cinematography, editing and sound design, and they pretty much set a new benchmark for directing action. The rest of Saving Private Ryan, however, is a much more conventional squad-on-a-mission war movie. Beyond the setting and the set design, the story itself is also largely fictional. The basic plot of Saving Private Ryan hinges on a military bureaucracy that miraculously notices that 3 men on their rapidly expanding list of casualties happen to be brothers.
This man was killed last week in New Guinea.
Daniel, Ryan.
The 3 men are brothers, sir. I've just learned that this afternoon their mother's going to be getting all 3 telegrams.
For some reason, this coincidence is brought to the attention of the US Army's Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, who takes time out of backstopping the largest amphibious invasion in human history to personally authorise a rescue mission for the missing private.
The boy's alive. We are going to send somebody to find him. And we are going to get him the hell out of there.
While this premise is pretty far-fetched, it does have a kernel of truth to it. In 1944, the US Army was genuinely worried about PR blowback resulting from multiple casualties within the same family. There had been a significant public outcry a couple of years earlier when 5 members of the same family, the Sullivans, had been killed when the ship they were serving on was sunk during the Battle of Guadalcanal. Following that incident, the US military became more strict about separating enlisted family members into different units. They also introduced a policy that would relieve servicemen of combat duty if multiple siblings were killed. Robert Rodat's screenplay for Saving Private Ryan was inspired by the story of Sergeant Fritz Nyland, who was a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne Division who was sent back to the United States under this policy after 2 of his brothers were killed and another went missing in action. Crucially though, in Fritz's case, there was no stirring speech from the US Army's Chief of Staff and no dramatic rescue mission. If you read up on Fritz's story, you'll find that most accounts hand-wavingly credit military officials with sending him back home, but in reality it was the regimental chaplain for the 101st Airborne Division that learned of Fritz's circumstances and petitioned for him to be sent back, chaplains being the closest thing that GIs could get to a Union rep. Even then, it took the Army 4 months to process the paperwork. Spielberg's version of events is obviously much more dramatic. In addition to the beach landing scene in the opening, the film includes several action set pieces. We get a sniper duel in the ruins of a French town, an assault on a machine gun nest in the countryside, and a chaotic last-ditch defensive battle over a bridge at the fictional French town of Ramel. In order to make these action scenes seem more plausible and serious, Spielberg cast two middle-aged actors in Wardaddy-type roles. The first was 41-year-old Tom Hanks, who plays the lead role of Captain John Miller, and the second was 37-year-old Tom Sizemore, who plays Sergeant Mike Horvath. Both of these characters are presented as jaded veterans who have been leading their company of troops in campaigns across North Africa, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula.
Could be Ryben on BAR, Jackson, Wade, Beasley, and Caparza.
Beasley's dead.
All right, Mellish then. We got anybody who speaks French?
Not that I know of.
And if you think about the films that Hank starred in during the 90s, like Sleepless in Seattle and Forrest Gump, Spielberg's decision to make him the lead in this very capital S serious war film seems a little unorthodox. Before the film was released, there were actually quite a few people that felt that Hanks wouldn't be able to pull off this battle-hardened warrior character, and there's still a certain segment of fans who think the role should have gone to someone who looked or acted more like John Wayne.
Tom, I said it then and I'll say it now. I don't think you're a bankable movie star.
But that critique misses Spielberg's intent, which was to put a relatable, fatherly figure front and centre to offset all the carnage and violence that his visual effects team were cooking up. And if you look at the span of Hank's career, you'll see that he's often cast to fulfill this sort of sanitising role. He's the person you hire when you want to put a sympathetic face on a sinister job, whether that be a mob enforcer, a CIA asset, a politician who funnels money to Islamic militants, or a goofy member of the LAPD.
Well, Raymond, I guess it's just you and me and your balls and this drawer.
It might not seem that there's a pressing need to sanitise the US Army of 1944, because at the time of its release at least, the general consensus was that fighting fascism was a good thing. However, combat, as depicted in Saving Private Ryan, is fairly brutal. So Spielberg felt the need to make sure that his audience understood that the average American GI was a reluctant participant in this carnage, rather than being an enthusiastic young volunteer. And that seems to be how we've ended up with the character of John Miller, a school teacher who just wants to get the job done so he can return to his wife and his former life.
I teach English composition. This little town called Adley, Pennsylvania. The last 11 years, I've been at Thomas Alva Edison High School. I was a coach of the baseball team in the springtime.
Be doggone.
Back home, and I tell people what I do for a living, and they think, well, that figures. But over here, it's a big mystery.
The problem with this backstory is that Miller is also presented as a captain in one of the US Army's Ranger battalions. And for those who might not be aware, Rangers are a somewhat specialised light infantry force modelled after the British Commandos. They were made up of highly motivated soldiers who'd volunteered to go through the gruelling Ranger selection process. Given the somewhat elite status of the Rangers within the US military, you might think Miller's backstory and his attitude towards the war are a bit strange, and you'd be right. These battalions didn't enlist guys in their 40s, and they certainly didn't conscript their officers. Like almost everyone else in this film, Captain Miller is fictional, which makes it a little unfair to criticise this character's authenticity. However, Spielberg did assign Miller to a real unit, Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. So if we want to compare the film to reality, we can start by looking at the real commander of Charlie Company. The man we find is Captain Ralph Einar Goranson from Libertyville, Illinois, who voluntarily enlisted in the US Army a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor at the age of 22. Unlike Miller, Goranson was not a veteran of any previous campaigns when he was sent to Normandy. Like most of the US troops who landed on D-Day, Goranson found out what combat was like when he landed on Omaha Beach. By that stage, he was 24. In terms of his age, Goranson was typical of US infantrymen in World War II, and the original script for Saving Private Ryan acknowledges the youth of these infantry units by introducing the Rangers as boys who are mostly 18 or 19 years old, led by a CEO in his early 30s who we're told is by far the oldest man in the craft. Spielberg himself highlighted the age of these soldiers in various interviews and commemorations of the D-Day landings.
It came down to the men of D-Day. It came down to the junior officers, the NCOs, and all the enlisted men, a whole bunch of 20-year-old kids, some even younger.
So why did Spielberg decide to cast his film with actors that, on average, were about 10 years older? Well, most directors aspiring for some level of historical accuracy don't like to draw attention to the age gap between their actors and the people they portray. But during the press tour for Saving Private Ryan, Spielberg did try to justify his casting decisions. In an interview with Roger Ebert, he claimed that his cast had the right look for youths of the 1940s. Spielberg's argument was that young men of that era simply looked older than the young men of today, and he claimed that his casting decisions were guided by the faces that he saw in the newsreels. We look more innocent now. In those days, all the boys looked like men. Today, boys 17 or 18 years old look like children. But back then, the 16, 17, 18-year-old face actually looked sometimes like a 29 to 35-year-old face. If you look at all those guys coming down the gangplanks in the documentary footage, they all look much older than they actually were. Casting director Diane Crittenden, who vetted actors for Terrence Malick's World War II drama The Thin Red Line, reached pretty much the same conclusion.
We had all of this research from old Life magazine articles and all sorts of books on World War II and pictures. I mean, there's loads and loads and loads of pictures of people of that time. And it was people looked older than they were. I mean, it's a very interesting thing when you look at these people and you realize they're 18, 19 years old, but they look like men already. So we use that as a sort of template of all of those to try to find people who didn't feel too contemporary.
When pressed by Ebert on what might explain this apparent difference in appearance, Spielberg joked that it was probably bottled water. I don't know what it is. I think in the 1940s we looked a lot more like our ancestors who came over on the ships to settle here from other countries. Today, the one country that still has faces from the 1940s are the Australians. Australian boys look as grown up as the American boys looked 50 years ago. And look, as an Australian, I can confirm, that's totally true. These guys look exactly like the guys I went to uni with. But all joking aside, Spielberg is not entirely wrong. There's all sorts of reasons we might not look like our ancestors at the same age. Nowadays, we have sunscreen and cosmetic dentistry, very few people smoke, and we have very strict child labour laws. By comparison, most of the young men assigned to infantry regiments in World War II came from working-class families. They'd grown up during the Great Depression, and by the time they were drafted, a lot of them had already been doing manual labour of some sort or another from a pretty young age. And that sort of work definitely ages you prematurely. Take, for example, actor Wilford Brimley, who for some reason has become the benchmark for ageing celebrities. Brimley was born in the 1930s, he joined the US Marines at 19, he worked as a ranch hand and a blacksmith and a Hollywood stuntman before he got his first speaking part. And that sort of resume definitely takes its toll on your body, so this is what Brimley looked like at 52. By way of comparison, you have Paul Rudd, who was born in the late 60s, studied drama in New York and Oxford, got his first acting gig at 22, and has presumably been living on kale salads ever since. Here's Rudd at the same age. To quote Indiana Jones, it's not the years, it's the mileage. But I'm not sure this lets Spielberg off the hook for fudging the numbers in Saving Private Ryan. You could easily make the argument that this superficial difference between generations puts an even greater onus on filmmakers to set the record straight. If people are bound to get the wrong impression from photos and newsreel footage, then surely you'd want to correct this misconception if you had the opportunity. After all, by his own admission, Spielberg was not just trying to make entertainment. He was trying to pay tribute to his father's generation by providing modern audiences with a definitive depiction of this moment in history.
Saving Private Ryan was never meant to be thrilling. It was never meant to be an adventure. It was meant to be a recreation, a kind of a documentation of the closest I could get to the experiences of those who fought there on June 6th. So there was a lot of research that went into the recreation of that landing from the actual kids who landed.
More to the point, Spielberg ought to have known that the newsreel footage he was using as reference was in itself propaganda. US operations during World War II were recorded by cameramen assigned to the US Army Signal Corps. Their footage was compiled and edited by the Office of War Information, whose main responsibility was shoring up public support for the war effort, so naturally they had an interest in selecting images and faces that the public would find acceptable. And either by accident or by design, Spielberg decided to follow suit when it came to casting his D-Day epic. To give credit where it's due, Saving Private Ryan does at least force viewers to consider the plight of young soldiers by presenting us with the death of the platoon's medic, Irwin Wade, played by a 23-year-old Giovanni Ribisi. Having been shot in an assault on a machine gun nest, Wade dies in a state of panic, calling out for his mother. And one of the more harrowing things you come across in memoirs and interviews with combat veterans are descriptions of more or less that exact scenario. These were the moments that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Arguably, there is a much shorter and much more honest war film within the runtime of Saving Private Ryan. You just need to skip the sentimental opening scene and roll credits right after the death of Irwin Wade. But instead of giving audiences time to dwell on the death of Wade, Spielberg gives us one last action set piece. Now, a lot of very far-fetched things happen over the course of Saving Private Ryan, but it's the final act of the film, set in the fictional town of Rommel, that really undermines Spielberg's claims of honesty and authenticity. To set the scene, by this stage Miller's squad has already lost 2 members while trying to find Private Ryan, and the characters have spent most of the film's runtime griping about the moral calculus of sending 8 men to rescue 1 guy for the purposes of public relations. Meanwhile, Miller himself appears to be coming unstuck due to survivor's guilt at having lost so many of the soldiers under his command. When they eventually find Private Ryan, he refuses to abandon the unit he's joined up with, who've taken it upon themselves to defend a bridge that we're led to believe has some sort of strategic value. Despite the fact that they are right in the path of a major German counterattack, they decide to try to hold their position. Unfortunately, Ryan's unit consists of only a handful of guys, and all they have at their disposal is some small arms and some loose mortar rounds. Now, it's never a good idea to quibble about tactics in these films, because that's really not what they're about. But we should acknowledge just how avoidable this battle is, because Spielberg makes a point of showing us that Ryan's comrades have wired up the bridge with explosives so they can strand the Germans on the other side. But there's no real explanation for why destroying the bridge has to be the absolute last resort. And it's hard not to notice that it is a very small bridge over a very narrow river. If all you can reasonably be expected to do is buy some time to let reinforcements catch up, then demolishing the bridge seems like the most sensible option. I bring this up because the film doesn't really provide us with a good explanation for why Miller's squad would agree to participate in this harebrained scheme. All we get is a scene where Sergeant Horvath comes up with some mawkish line about finding redemption by saving Private Ryan, a task that they're unlikely to achieve if they let him and his comrades serve as a speed bump for the oncoming Panzer Division.
But another part of me thinks, what if by some miracle we stay and actually make it out of here? Someday we might look back on this and decide that saving Private Ryan was the one decent thing we were able to pull out of this whole god-awful shitty mess. That's what I was thinking, sir. Like you said, Captain. We do that, we all earn the right to go home.
Oh, brother.
Interestingly, Brodak's original script for Saving Private Ryan is a little more plausible, at least in terms of motivation. In Brodak's version, it's not Captain Miller and Sergeant Horvath that decide in a fit of sentimentality to stay behind with Ryan to hold the bridge. Rather, it's the members of Miller's squad that argue in favour of staying, because they want the chance to win medals and win glory. Which might sound a bit daft, but again, these soldiers are supposed to be 18 or 19 years old. And this raises an interesting possibility. What if Spielberg had followed Brodak's screenplay a little more closely? What if Captain Miller had put the decision to defend the bridge at Rommel to a vote? How would an actor like, say, Tom Sizemore have conveyed that agonising decision? How would he have tried to show that combination of dread and anticipation? The awareness that he might be throwing his life away, set against his loyalty to his comrades. What would that look like?
If I were you, I would be smart. I would cut loose of this.
Well, you know, for me, the action is the juice. I'm in.
I know that's not really relevant to the thesis, I just wanted to watch part of a better movie. But even if Spielberg went with Rodat's original story, the main problem with Saving Private Ryan would still loom large, which is that these guys are all too old and too jaded to be doing something this dumb. So perhaps the better question is, what would the final act of Saving Private Ryan look like if both the motivations and the characters themselves were more realistic? Well, it might look more like Bernhard Vicky's 1959 war film, Debrooker. Vicky's film was based on the memoirs of a young German veteran by the name of Gregor Dorfmeister, and it centres on a group of German high schoolers in April 1945.
Schmeiß ich doch hier eine Panzerdivision rein. Du bist ja verrückt, da ist doch die ganze Kampflinie unterbrochen. Darf ich die Herren vom Generalstab bitten, die Englischstunde fortzusetzen?
Despite the imminent collapse of the German army, these kids remain loyal to the state and eager to play some part in the war.
Hier ist meine Einberufung. Wir müssen uns morgen in der Kaserne melden. Ist das wirklich wahr? Was? Ich war beim Standortoffizier, ist meine Einberufung. Liegt bestimmt schon zu Hause.
As the Allied armies converge on Berlin, these 7 boys are hastily conscripted, armed and assigned to a local Volkssturm militia unit. As the front line gets closer, their teacher quietly appeals to the local military commander to give the boys some sort of make-work task that will keep them out of harm's way. He relents and they end up being assigned to guard a small, strategically meaningless bridge on the outskirts of their hometown. But as the American army approaches, their commanding officer wanders off and gets himself killed. And in his absence, the boys are left to fend for themselves. They argue over whether they should go home or stay and fight, but in the end, the issue is decided by the most eager member of the group, when he asks his friend, Bist du feige? Are you a coward?
Also, wer will seine Waffen wegwerfen und nach Hause gehen? Du?
Wieso denn gerade ich?
Ihr beide? Nein.
Unwilling to lose face in front of one another, the boys decide to dig in and hold the bridge. When the first American tanks roll up a little while later, the boys put up a heroic defense. They manage to turn back the initial assault, but then the artillery starts coming down and it all goes pretty poorly from that point on. While Spielberg gives us battle as high drama, Vicky gives us battle as black comedy. At one stage, the film cuts to a veteran German soldier watching from a distance and wondering why anyone would put up such a fierce fight when they could just retreat across the river and blow the bridge.
Mal diese blöden Hunde, zuletzt kriegen wir auch noch eine verpasst. Diese Idioten hauen sich an der Brücke mit den Amis rum, statt sie durchzulassen. Sonst hätten wir die Brücke schon längst hochgejagt.
Um Gottes Willen, was ist denn?
Unlike the final act of Saving Private Ryan, the events portrayed in Debrooker actually took place, although Vicky took some creative license by adding a couple of characters and compressing 2 separate incidents into one. The real Greek tragedy aspect of the story is that the battle took place on the 1st of May 1945, the day after Hitler committed suicide, and the postscript to the film reveals that this little Thermopylae was so inconsequential when compared to the wider devastation taking place in Germany at the time that it received no mention in any official German sources. Obviously, these are 2 very different films made by very different directors with very different intentions. My point here is that the story told in Debrooker is in many respects much more honest than the one Spielberg presents in Saving Private Ryan. It shows you the demographics that are most susceptible to pro-war propaganda. It shows you that bravery doesn't necessarily equate to victory. And with just 3 little words, it tells you why young men willingly risk their lives.
Und du? Bist du feige?
Debrooker tells you something about war. Saving Private Ryan, on the other hand, mainly tells you how Spielberg felt about his dad.
Dad, you're the greatest. Thank you for showing me that there is honor in looking back and respecting the past. I love you very much. This is for you. Thank you.